Imagine a city of 4 million people. A city of museums, universities, grand boulevards, and some of the most beautiful architecture in the world. Now imagine that same city completely surrounded. No way in, no way out. The roads blocked, the railways cut, the skies full of enemy aircraft, the sound of artillery growing closer every single hour, every single minute. That was Berlin in April 1945. And inside that city, deep underground in a concrete bunker, sat the man who had started it all. Adolf Hitler, 60 years old, broken in body, shaking hands, pale skin. A man who had once commanded armies across an entire continent, now commanding ghosts. This is the story of the final battle for Berlin. But it is also the story of one single tank, a Tiger I, number 323. A machine that became one of the most photographed symbols of German defeat in the entire war. How it got there, why it fought, and what happened to the men inside it. This is a story of the last stand of the Third Reich. To understand how Berlin fell, you must first understand what happened in the weeks before the final assault. By the spring of 1945, Germany was finished as a fighting force on any rational military level. The Western Allies had already crossed the Rhine. American and British forces were pushing deep into the heart of Germany from the west, and from the east, the Red Army, battle-hardened, enormous and burning with a fury born from years of unimaginable suffering, was closing in fast. The Soviets had suffered losses that are almost impossible to comprehend today. Millions of soldiers killed, entire cities destroyed, villages burned, civilians murdered by the millions. And now, after 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history, Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov had one final objective in his sights: Berlin. Stalin wanted it taken by the 1st of May 1945. The 1st of May was International Workers' Day, a symbolic date for the Soviet Union, a communist triumph to be celebrated with the capture of the Nazi capital. And Zhukov, a man who had never lost a major battle, was not about to fail his commander. Now, on the 16th of April 1945, Zhukov launched his great offensive. Over 900,000 Soviet soldiers, over 3,000 tanks, nearly 17,000 artillery guns, all of them pointed at one direction, west, toward Berlin. Standing directly in their path was Germany's last real defensive line east of the city. The Seelow Heights, a long ridge of elevated ground rising sharply above the flat Oder River floodplain, approximately 100 kilometers east of Berlin. In military terms, it was good defensive ground. The ridge gave the defenders clear views across the open terrain below. Any attacking force would have to cross wide, soft, waterlogged fields, and then climb the steep ridge under fire. The German commander responsible for holding Seelow was General Gotthard Heinrichs. He was one of the best defensive commanders Germany had produced in the entire war. Quiet, methodical, deeply professional. Unlike many of Hitler's generals, Heinrichs did not believe in blind obedience. He believed in keeping his men alive long enough to actually fight. On the night before the Soviet attack, Heinrichs made a bold decision. He pulled the bulk of his frontline troops back from their forward positions. He knew the Soviets would open with a massive artillery bombardment. Let the shells fall on empty trenches, he reasoned, then bring the men back to their positions the moment the artillery stopped. It was a calculated gamble, and at first it worked beautifully. When Zhukov launched his assault in the pre-dawn darkness of the 16th of April, the famous searchlights, 143 of them, lit up the battlefield to blind and disorient the defenders. But the defenders were not where they were supposed to be. The artillery bombardment fell largely on empty positions. The Soviet infantry, advancing in the blinding light and churned-up mud, quickly became disorganized. Progress on the first day was much slower than Zhukov had planned. Stalin was not pleased, but numbers matter in war, and the Soviets had numbers that the Germans simply could not match. Wave after wave of Soviet infantry and armor crashed against the heights. The German defenders fought with extraordinary courage. Young men, old men, boys who had been pulled from schools and factories just weeks before, all of them holding rifles and anti-tank weapons against the full weight of the Soviet war machine. They fought for 3 days, 3 days of almost continuous combat, artillery landing every few seconds, tanks burning on the slopes, men dying in numbers that are painful to read about even today. By the 19th of April, it was over. The Seelow Heights had fallen, the German line had broken, and the road to Berlin was open. What remained of the German forces began falling back toward the city. Some units retreated in good order, others simply dissolved, men throwing down their weapons and trying to reach their families before the end came. The Soviets poured through the gap and spread out across the open ground to the west, moving fast, surrounding the city from multiple directions simultaneously. Berlin was now a trap, and inside that trap, over 2 million civilians were about to experience something that no city in the Western world had seen in modern times. Among the German units that pulled back from Salem toward Berlin was a formation that will sit at the very center of our story, the Muncheberg Panzer Division. The name sounds impressive, but the reality was something very different. The Muncheberg was not a traditional panzer division built up over years of training and combat experience. It was what the Germans called a Kampfgruppe, a battle group, an emergency formation thrown together from whatever was available in the final desperate weeks of the war. It had been formed on the 25th of February 1945 at the Kummersdorf testing and proving ground south of Berlin. Kummersdorf was one of Germany's most important military research facilities. Tanks were tested there, new weapons were evaluated there, and now, with the Red Army closing in, the men and machines of Kummersdorf were stripped out and thrown into battle. The initial unit was built around repaired and refurbished tanks. Whatever could be made to run was pressed into service. In its early days, the division fielded 4 King Tigers, the Tiger II, the heaviest and most powerful tank the German army had ever deployed in significant numbers. It also had 1 Tiger I and 1 Jagdtiger, a massive tank destroyer built on the King Tiger chassis, mounting a 128mm gun, the most powerful anti-tank weapon used by any nation in the entire war. These were formidable machines. In the right conditions, with fuel and ammunition and trained crews, they could stop almost anything the Red Army could throw at them. But conditions in April 1945 were very far from right. On the 14th of March, the division was expanded. 11 Panzer IV tanks, an additional Panther, and more Tigers were absorbed into the unit. On paper, it was growing. In reality, every day of fighting wore it down faster than replacements could arrive. Fuel was desperately short. Spare parts were almost impossible to find. Ammunition was being rationed. And the men, some of them veterans, many of them not, were exhausted in a way that goes beyond simple physical tiredness. These men had been fighting continuously for months. They had watched their country collapse around them. Many had lost contact with their families. Some knew that their homes had already been overrun. They were fighting not because they believed in final victory. Almost nobody believed in that anymore by April 1945. They were fighting because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing, because orders still came down from above, and because the men beside them were still fighting. That is what kept armies moving in the final weeks of the Second World War. Not ideology, not belief. Simply the momentum of men who had been soldiers for so long that they did not know how to be anything else. The Muncheberg Division fought at the Seelow Heights. It took casualties it could not replace, and when the line broke on the 19th of April, it fell back with the rest, turning its remaining heavy armor westward toward the burning skyline of Berlin. The city they were entering was already dying. Soviet artillery had been hitting Berlin's outer districts for days. Fires burned across the eastern suburbs. Water mains had been cut. Electricity flickered on and off. The underground railway, the U-Bahn, still ran on some lines, carrying terrified civilians deeper into the city. On the streets above, the German army was building its final defense. 3 rings had been prepared around the city, barricades of rubble and concrete, anti-tank ditches dug across main roads, artillery pieces dragged into apartment building basements to fire through holes knocked in the walls. Old men and teenage boys from the Volkssturm, the People's Militia, handed rifles many had never fired and told to hold their positions. And at the center of it all, in the innermost ring of defense, was the area that would see the very last and most ferocious fighting of the Battle of Berlin. They called it Sector Z, the Citadel, and that is exactly where Tiger 323 would make its final stand. There is a photograph taken in Berlin in the last days of April 1945. It shows a wide boulevard completely empty. No cars, no people, no movement of any kind. On both sides of the road, grand stone buildings stand with their windows blown out, smoke rising from somewhere behind them. And in the middle of the road, blocking the entire width of the street, sits a German Tiger tank, its long gun pointing directly at the camera, waiting. That photograph captures something that words struggle to describe: the silence before the final storm, the moment when an entire civilization stands at the edge of its own ending. Sector Z was that moment made real, made physical, made into streets and buildings and barricades and men with guns who knew on some level that this was the end. And yet they fought anyway. This is what happened inside the Citadel. By the 24th of April 1945, Soviet forces had completely encircled Berlin. The ring was closed, there was no escape route, no relief column coming, no miracle weapon arriving at the last moment. The city was cut off from the rest of Germany entirely, and what remained of the German government, what remained of the Third Reich itself, was now compressed into a shrinking perimeter in the center of the city. At the heart of that perimeter was the government quarter, a district of enormous heavy stone buildings that had been built to project power and permanence. The Reich Chancellery, the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Aviation, the Foreign Office, buildings designed to last 1,000 years, now being turned into fortresses for a last stand that most of the men defending them knew would last only days. This area was officially designated Sector Z. The letter Z stood for Citadel, citadel in German. The name was chosen deliberately. A citadel is the innermost stronghold of a fortress, the place that holds out longest when everything around it has already fallen, the place where the last defenders make their final stand, and that is precisely what it became. The defenses of Sector Z were formidable in ways that surprised even experienced Soviet commanders. Yes, the Germans were outnumbered. Yes, their supply lines were gone. Yes, their air support had essentially ceased to exist. But the physical terrain of central Berlin gave the defenders enormous advantages that raw numbers alone could not simply overcome. The buildings themselves were the first obstacle. These were not ordinary apartment blocks or office buildings. These were government ministry buildings, massive, thick-walled stone structures built in the monumental style that the Nazi regime loved. Walls that were meters thick, basements that could shelter hundreds of men from artillery fire, rooftops that gave defenders clear fields of fire over the streets below. Every window became a firing position, every doorway a potential ambush point. To clear a single building like that required not just infantry but coordinated artillery support, engineers with explosives, and often brutal room-by-room fighting that cost lives at every staircase and every corridor. The Soviets had done this before, at Stalingrad, at Budapest, at Königsberg. They knew the cost, and they paid it again in Berlin. The second obstacle was water. The government quarter sat on a complex network of waterways, the Spree River, the Landwehr Canal, and various other smaller channels that cut the district into sections. Each waterway was a natural defensive line. Each bridge became a choke point that had to be fought over. And where no natural water obstacle existed, the Germans created their own. An uncompleted section of the U-Bahn, the Berlin Underground Railway, running beneath Königsplatz in front of the Reichstag, was deliberately flooded. Combined with anti-tank ditches dug across the square, the approach to the Reichstag became a killing ground for any attacking force. The third obstacle was the flak towers. Berlin had several enormous flak towers, massive reinforced concrete structures that had been built during the war to provide anti-aircraft defense over the city. They were extraordinary pieces of engineering. The walls were meters thick, thick enough to resist almost any conventional artillery shell. The towers rose high above the city skyline, giving the guns mounted on their rooftops commanding views for miles in every direction. In 1945, those same guns, originally designed to shoot down aircraft, were turned horizontally and used against Soviet tanks and infantry. An 88mm flak gun firing horizontally at ground level was one of the most effective anti-tank weapons of the entire war. The Germans had proved that in the North African desert years before, and now those same guns, on top of structures that Soviet artillery could barely scratch, were covering every major approach into the government quarter. The most important of these was the Zoo Flak Tower, located in the Tiergarten, Berlin's great central park, just to the west of the government district. It dominated the entire area. Soviet tank commanders who tried to push their vehicles down the main avenues quickly discovered that the flak tower's guns could engage them at ranges where they had almost no chance of hitting back. It was a problem that cost the Red Army a great deal of blood before they found ways to work around it. I visited the site of the Zoo Flak Tower recently. The tower itself was demolished after the war. The Soviets blew it up in 1947, a process that took several attempts because the concrete was so thick. But standing in that part of the Tiergarten today, you can still feel the geography, the open lines of sight, the way the ground rises slightly, the way the main roads converge. It is easy to understand, standing there, why every attacking army that came down those roads paid such a heavy price. Into this fortress came the Muncheberg Panzer Division, or what remained of it. By the time the Muncheberg pulled back into Berlin's defensive perimeter, its strength had been ground down to a fraction of what it had once been. The heavy tank losses at Seelow, the constant fighting during the retreat, the chronic fuel shortages, all of it had taken its toll. What had once been a division built around some of Germany's most powerful armoured vehicles was now a collection of a handful of functioning tanks, some supporting vehicles, and exhausted crews who had been fighting almost without pause for weeks. But those few functioning heavy tanks were still extraordinarily lovable. A Tiger I, even in 1945, was still a fearsome weapon in the right circumstances. Its 88mm gun could destroy any Soviet tank in service at combat ranges. Its frontal armour, while no longer impenetrable against the latest Soviet anti-tank guns, was still thick enough to shrug off hits from many weapons. In urban fighting, where ranges were short and the terrain was chaotic, a single Tiger could hold a street intersection against a much larger force, and it was exactly that role that the Muncheberg's remaining Tigers were now assigned. General Werner Mummert, commanding the Muncheberg Division, established his headquarters inside the Zoo Flak Tower. It was a logical choice. The tower was essentially indestructible by conventional means. It had its own power supply, its own water supply, and enough space inside to house thousands of people. Civilians had taken shelter there in large numbers. Wounded soldiers filled its lower levels, and from its upper floors, Mummert could observe the battle unfolding across a wide area of central Berlin. From that command post, Mummert directed his remaining armour to critical positions across the defence sector. Each tank was a precious and irreplaceable asset. Losing one to a mechanical breakdown or a fuel shortage was almost as painful as losing one to enemy fire. Every movement had to be carefully considered, every position chosen for maximum defensive value. One Tiger I was positioned somewhere near the Zoo Flak Tower itself, at the western end of the great Charlottenburger Chaussee, the long straight avenue that ran through the heart of the Tiergarten from the Victory Column to the Brandenburg Gate. And another Tiger I, number 323, was positioned at the eastern end of that same avenue, beside the Reichstag, facing the Brandenburg Gate. To understand why Tiger 323 was placed where it was, you need to understand the ground it was covering. The Brandenburg Gate stands at the eastern edge of the Tiergarten, at the point where the Charlottenburger Chaussee meets the old heart of Berlin. It is one of the most recognizable monuments in the world, a great neoclassical stone arch topped by the famous quadriga, the Chariot of Victory. In 1945, it stood at the junction between two of the most critical defensive positions in the entire citadel. To the north of the gate was Königsplatz, the great open square in front of the Reichstag. Any Soviet force that broke through the defences north of the Tiergarten would have to cross that square to reach the Reichstag. Tiger 323, positioned beside the Reichstag, could cover that approach with its gun. To the south of the gate was the Tiergarten itself, the park where the emergency airstrip had been set up on the Charlottenburger Chaussee. Any Soviet armoured thrust down that avenue from the west would come directly toward Tiger 323's position. The tank was essentially covering two directions simultaneously, acting as a mobile pillbox, or as close to mobile as a tank running on near-empty fuel tanks could be. Its crew knew the position. They had studied the ground. They had probably walked it on foot in the days before the final Soviet assault began. 5 men, a commander, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a radio operator. 5 men inside 60 tons of steel, in the middle of a dying city, waiting for the Red Army to come. They did not wait long. On the 26th of April, the Soviets launched their assault on Königsplatz and the Reichstag defences in earnest. Red Army infantry and armour crossed the multi-bridge over the Spree River, under intense fire, fighting through the massive Ministry of the Interior building, which the Soviet soldiers nicknamed Himmler's house after the head of the SS, and pushing into the diplomatic quarter adjacent to it. The fighting for Himmler's house alone took the better part of a day. The building was enormous. The German defenders used every floor, every room, every staircase. Soviet engineers had to blow holes through walls to advance from room to room. Artillery was fired directly through windows at point-blank range. It was not warfare, as it is usually imagined. It was something closer to industrial slaughter, and it was only the beginning, because beyond Himmler's house across the flooded square, through the anti-tank ditches and past the 88mm guns, stood the Reichstag itself. There is a moment in battle that every soldier who has experienced it remembers for the rest of his life. It is not the moment the shooting starts, it is the moment just before, when everything goes quiet, when the artillery stops, when the smoke settles for just a few seconds, and every man on both sides of the line knows, absolutely knows, that what comes next will change everything. The men defending the Reichstag experienced that moment on the morning of the 30th of April 1945. They had been fighting for days without meaningful rest. Their ammunition was running low. Their wounded were lying in the corridors because there was nowhere else to put them. The building around them was being torn apart piece by Soviet artillery that fired directly at the walls from just across the flooded square. Chunks of stone the size of furniture were being blasted off the facade. The roof was burning in several places. The great dome that had once stood above the building had been destroyed years before in a fire. What remained was a battered, smoke-blackened shell of one of Germany's most historic buildings, and they were going to hold it, or die trying. This is what the final battle for the Reichstag looked like. From the inside, to understand the scale of what the Soviets were attempting, you need to understand what Königsplatz actually was in April 1945. Today it is a calm, open area in central Berlin. Tourists walk across it every day without giving much thought to what happened there. But in April 1945, that ground was one of the most dangerous pieces of real estate on the Eastern Front. The square itself was wide and flat, offering almost no natural cover for attacking infantry. Any Soviet soldier who stepped out into that open ground was immediately exposed to fire from the Reichstag building directly ahead, from German positions in the buildings to the left and right, and from the guns of the Zoo Flak Tower firing from behind the Soviet lines of advance. The flooded U-Bahn cutting and the anti-tank ditches that blocked the square meant that tanks could not simply drive across. They had to find crossing points, which were few and heavily covered by German fire. The Soviets had tried crossing that ground several times in the preceding days. Each attempt had been stopped. Each attempt had cost lives. Soviet commanders looked at the casualty figures, and then looked at their maps, and then looked at the Reichstag still standing across the square, and made the same calculation every time. They needed more artillery, more infantry, more coordination, and they needed to suppress Tiger 323, which was sitting beside the Reichstag and making any armoured advance across the northern edge of the Tiergarten extremely costly. General Vasily Chuikov, the same commander who had defended Stalingrad in 1942, was coordinating much of the assault on the central government district. He understood urban warfare better than almost any other general alive. He had learned it the hard way in the rubble of Stalingrad, where his 62nd Army had held the west bank of the Volga against everything the Germans could throw at them. What he had learned there he now applied here, in reverse, You use the rubble. You advance in small groups. You suppress the defenders with direct fire. You never give them a moment to reorganize. Hufrid, he also knew something else that he had learnt at Stalingrad. Sometimes you simply have to accept the cost and push through anyway, because the alternative, stopping, was not an option Stalin would accept. By the morning of the 30th of April, Soviet forces had fought their way close enough to the Reichstag to begin the final assault. Artillery, including heavy guns that had been dragged forward through the rubble at enormous effort, was firing directly at the building's facade and windows from just a few hundred meters away. The noise was beyond description. Witnesses later recalled that it was not possible to hear the person standing next to you, even if they were shouting directly into your ear. Soviet infantry from the 150th Rifle Division were assigned the task of taking the building itself. These were experienced soldiers. Many of them had been fighting since the early years of the war. They had crossed rivers under fire. They had cleared fortified villages. They had survived things that would be unimaginable to most people. But several of them later admitted that the approach to the Reichstag, crossing that open ground under fire, stumbling through the water obstacles and the anti-tank ditches, was among the most frightening things they had ever experienced. They crossed, not all of them, but enough. The first Soviet soldiers reached the steps of the Reichstag sometime in the early afternoon. Getting through the doors was another battle entirely. The entrances had been barricaded and heavily defended. Engineers used explosives to blow open the main doors. Infantry poured through the gaps and immediately encountered German defenders at extremely close range, sometimes just a few meters away in the smoke and darkness inside the building. What followed inside the Reichstag was not warfare in any organized or tactical sense. It was something more primitive, floor by floor, room by room, sometimes hand to hand. German defenders who had nowhere left to retreat fought with a desperation that shocked even hardened Soviet veterans. Every staircase was contested. Every corridor was an ambush waiting to happen. The building's interior, already wrecked by years of neglect and the bombing of recent days, became a maze of rubble, broken furniture, fallen ceiling sections and bodies. Outside, while this was happening inside the Reichstag, Tiger 323 was still fighting. The tank had been in position beside the Reichstag for days by this point. Its exact movements during the final battle are difficult to reconstruct with complete certainty. The chaos of those final days meant that detailed records simply were not kept. But what is known tells a story that is both clear in its broad outlines and deeply human in its details. The Tiger's primary role was to cover the approaches to the Reichstag from the direction of the Tiergarten and the Brandenburg Gate. Any Soviet armor that tried to push up the Charlottenburger Chaussee from the west or work its way around the southern side of the Königsplatz came within range of Tiger 323's 88mm gun. At the short ranges involved in urban fighting, that gun was devastatingly effective. It could penetrate the armor of any Soviet tank, the T-34, the IS-2 heavy tank, anything at the distances that the street fighting involved. But fighting a Tiger in a city is a two-sided problem. Yes, the Tiger's gun is powerful. Yes, its armor is thick, but it is also slow. It turns slowly. Its long gun barrel, nearly 6 meters long, is a serious problem in narrow streets, where it can become caught between buildings or block the tank's ability to traverse the turret. And in a city full of rubble, the risk of throwing a track, losing one of the massive steel tracks that drove the vehicle, was constant. A Tiger that threw a track in the middle of a Berlin street in April 1945 was finished. There was no recovery vehicle coming, no repair crew with spare parts. It would simply be abandoned and destroyed by its own crew. Tiger 323 managed to avoid that fate, at least for a while. Supporting the Tiger in its position near the Reichstag was a small number of other vehicles from the Muncheberg Division. Among them was an armoured vehicle that has caused some confusion among historians over the years. Soviet photographs taken after the battle show the wreck of a vehicle near the Victory Column, about 2 kilometers from Tiger 323's position near the Reichstag. This vehicle has sometimes been identified as a Sturmgeschütz, a turretless assault gun, but careful examination of the photographs suggests something different. It was almost certainly a Munitionsträger, an ammunition carrier built on the Panzer IV chassis. The Muncheberg Division used these vehicles to carry ammunition forward to their tanks, which consumed shells at a rate that required constant resupply. A Tiger I carried 92 rounds for its main gun. In heavy urban fighting, that supply could be exhausted faster than most people would expect. An ammunition run from the stores at the Zuflack Tower to Tiger 323's position near the Reichstag was a journey of about 2 kilometers through streets that were under constant Soviet fire. That journey killed the crew of this vehicle. They were doing exactly the job they had been assigned, carrying ammunition forward to keep Tiger 323 fighting, when they were caught in the open near the victory column. Their vehicle was destroyed. They almost certainly did not survive. It is the kind of detail that gets lost in the larger narrative of great battles, the names that nobody records, the deaths that happen between the famous moments. But those men were part of the story of Tiger 323 just as much as the tank crew themselves. By Tiger 30th of April, the same day Soviet soldiers were fighting their way into the Reichstag, the situation around Tiger 323 had become critical. The Soviet advance had compressed the German defenses to the point where the tank's freedom of movement was almost completely gone. The streets around it were under fire from multiple directions. Fuel, which had been desperately short for days, was now essentially gone. The tank could no longer move in any meaningful way. That same day, Adolf Hitler died in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancery Garden, less than a kilometer from where Tiger 323 sat. He shot himself shortly after 3 in the afternoon. His body was carried up to the garden above and burned. The man who had started the whole catastrophe was gone, but the fighting continued, because orders still came down, because nobody at the front had been officially told, and because men in combat do not simply stop fighting because a distant leader has died. The crew of Tiger 323 did not know that Hitler was dead that afternoon. They were focused entirely on the immediate situation around them, the sounds of fighting inside the Reichstag just meters away, Soviet infantry moving through the ruins of the buildings to their north, the dwindling supply of ammunition, the knowledge that the fuel tanks were nearly empty and that the Tiger was, for all practical purposes, fixed in place. A tank that cannot move in urban combat is extraordinarily vulnerable. The Soviets knew this. Their infantry began working their way around the Tiger's flanks, approaching from angles where the tank's gun could not easily cover them. Soviet anti-tank teams, men carrying the RPG-43 shaped charge grenades or the more powerful RPG-6, looked for opportunities to get close enough to place their weapons against the Tiger's thinner side and rear armor. The crew fought back. The bow machine gun, operated by the radio operator, covered the front approaches. The commander watched through his vision ports and called out targets to the gunner. The loader worked as fast as he could, lifting the heavy 88mm shells and ramming them home. The driver sat at his controls, ready to move the tank the few meters in any direction that the fuel remaining in the tanks might allow. On the 1st of May 1945, the day after Hitler's death, the day that Stalin had wanted the Reichstag captured, Tiger 323 fought its last battle. The exact circumstances are not fully recorded. What is known is that at some point on that day the crew made the decision that there was no more fighting to be done. Whether the tank was hit by Soviet fire and disabled, or whether the ammunition was simply exhausted, or whether some combination of both factors made further resistance impossible, these details are lost in the chaos of those final hours. What the crew did next was follow standard German army procedure for the abandonment of a fighting vehicle. They destroyed the tank. They did not do this carelessly or half-heartedly. Destroying a Tiger properly, ensuring that its gun, its fire control system and its engine could not be recovered and used or studied by the enemy, was a disciplined process. It involved placing demolition charges in specific locations inside the vehicle and detonating them in sequence. The crew would have done this efficiently, because they were professional soldiers, and because everything they had done in the past weeks had been done efficiently even when everything around them was collapsing. Then they left the tank. Of the 5 men who had crewed Tiger 323 through the final Battle of Berlin, only one survived. We do not know his name with certainty. We do not know what happened to the other 4. We know only that they were there, that they fought, and that 4 of them did not come home. Wars end, but they leave things behind. They leave behind ruined buildings and broken roads. They leave behind graveyards that stretch further than the eye can see. They leave behind documents and photographs and the testimonies of survivors who spend the rest of their lives trying to describe something that most human beings will never experience, and hopefully never will. A single frozen moment captured on film that somehow contains the entire meaning of everything that happened. A photograph that people look at decades later and understand immediately, without needing any explanation, exactly what it is showing them. The photograph of Tiger 323, sitting destroyed and abandoned in front of the Brandenburg Gate, is one of those images. This is the story of what happened after the shooting stopped, what those photographs actually tell us, what the Soviets did with the wreck of the most famous tank in Berlin, and what you can find today standing on that same ground nearly 80 years later. Thermosagral's ranking finally fell on the 2nd of May 1945. Not in a single dramatic moment, but as the last pockets of German resistance inside the building simply ran out of the ability to continue. Ammunition gone, men dead or wounded, no relief coming, no orders that made any sense anymore. One by one, small groups of defenders stopped firing and either surrendered or tried to escape through the chaos of the surrounding streets. The surrender of Berlin as a whole came on the same day. General Helmuth Weidling, the commander of Berlin's defences, emerged from his command post in the early hours of the 2nd of May and surrendered the city to the Soviet forces. He had wanted to surrender days earlier. Now Hitler was dead, and Weidling made the decision that should have been made much sooner, because continuing to fight was simply causing more people to die for no purpose whatsoever. The guns fell silent across Berlin for the first time in nearly 2 weeks. In the sudden quiet, a quiet that witnesses described as almost physically shocking after so many days of constant artillery and gunfire, Soviet soldiers began moving through the streets of the government quarter. Some were looking for German soldiers who had not yet surrendered, some were securing buildings and positions, and some were simply walking, looking at what the battle had left behind, looking at the ruins of a city that had once been one of the great capitals of Europe, and what they found sitting beside the Reichstag in the morning light was Tiger 323, Polythervermink. The tank sat where it had been destroyed the previous day. Its gun was pointing in a slightly unusual direction, not forward, not in the direction it would have been covering during the battle, but rearward. This detail has puzzled historians and tank enthusiasts for many years, and the explanation is almost certainly straightforward. When Soviet engineers first approached the wreck, they needed to assess it. They rotated the turret, using either the tank's own remaining electrical power or manual effort to get a better look at the vehicle or to prepare it for eventual removal. The rearward-pointing gun that appears in the photographs is almost certainly the result of that post-battle inspection, not the position the gun was in when the tank was abandoned. The tank also sat among linden trees. These are the famous trees that line the Charlottenburger Chaussee, now renamed the Strasse der 17 Juni, and have stood there for well over a century. Looking at the Soviet photographs carefully, you can see that the tree trunks are close to the tank on both sides. This matters because it tells us something important. A Tiger I is a very large vehicle. Its gun barrel is nearly 6 meters long. The space between those trees would have made it extremely difficult for the tank to traverse its turret fully in either direction without the gun barrel striking a tree trunk. This has led some researchers to suggest that Tiger 323 was not actually in this position during the fighting, that it was moved here after the battle ended. The more likely explanation, and the one supported by the evidence, is that Soviet engineers dragged the wreck off the road shortly after the battle to clear the way for military traffic. Berlin's main avenues needed to be open for Soviet supply columns and troop movements. A 60-ton destroyed Tiger sitting in the middle of the road was a serious obstruction, so it was moved a few meters probably off the road and between the trees, where it remained for several weeks. It is a small detail, but it matters, because it means that the famous photographs of Tiger 323, the images that have appeared in books and documentaries and museum displays for nearly 80 years, show the tank not exactly as it was during the battle, but as it was arranged shortly after. History is like that sometimes. The most famous images of a moment are not always precisely what that moment looked like. In the weeks after Berlin's surrender, Tiger 323 became something that none of its crew could possibly have anticipated. It became a tourist attraction. Soviet soldiers from units all across the Berlin front came to see it. Having their photograph taken on top of a knocked-out German Tiger tank was enormously appealing. These men had been fighting Tiger tanks for years. They had lost friends and comrades to Tiger tanks. They had heard the stories, felt the fear, seen what an 88mm shell did to a Soviet T-34 at combat range, and now here was one sitting defeated and destroyed in front of the Brandenburg Gate, in front of one of Germany's most famous monuments, with the ruins of the Reichstag just visible in the background. The symbolism was almost too perfect. The tiger, the symbol of German military power, destroyed and humiliated in front of the very monument that Germany had built to celebrate its own military greatness. Soviet soldiers understood that symbolism instinctively. The photographs they took sitting on Tiger 323's hull or standing on its turret are some of the most human documents to come out of the final days of the Second World War. These are not propaganda images. They are men who had survived something terrible, marking the moment when it was finally over. Later photographs show Tiger 323 in a slightly different condition. The bow machine gun, the hull-mounted weapon operated by the radio operator, has been removed. A Soviet truck has been driven directly alongside the tank. These details tell a clear story. Soviet ordnance teams were systematically stripping the wreck of anything useful: weapons, optics, instruments. Anything that could be recovered and either reused or studied was taken. The great Soviet military machine was thorough in these matters. Nothing was wasted if it could be helped. Tomo sen fis problemolat to stop la retain misbreedzavit. On the Valflumweislinkate, the conception Toisnet, Tiger 323 was hauled away from its position in the Tiergarten. When American and British forces arrived in Berlin in July 1945 to take up their occupation zones, the tank was already gone. There are no photographs of Western Allied soldiers posing on Tiger 323, no British Army film footage of it, no American military photographs. The tank had vanished from the Tiergarten before the Western Allies ever set foot in that part of the city. Where it went initially was to one of the Soviet collecting points, large open areas where wrecked and captured German vehicles were gathered together for assessment. Soviet engineers and technical intelligence officers went through captured German equipment carefully. They were particularly interested in anything that might inform the development of Soviet tank technology: the Tiger's armor, its gun, its engine, its transmission, which was actually one of the Tiger's weakest points, prone to break down under the stress of the vehicle's enormous weight. How much of Tiger 323 was actually useful to Soviet engineers by the time it reached the collecting point is debatable. It had been destroyed by its own crew. The demolition charges would have wrecked the most sensitive internal components, but Soviet engineers were thorough. They would have gone through what remained with great care. Eventually, Tiger 323 was scrapped, broken down into raw steel, melted and repurposed. The vehicle that had once been the most powerful tank on the Western or Eastern Front, a 60-ton machine built with extraordinary precision by German engineers and crewed by men who had trained for years, ended its existence as scrap metal in a Soviet salvage yard. Nothing of it physically remains today. Kopsublorential, but here is something remarkable. Something that you can actually do right now in the 21st century if you ever find yourself in Berlin. You can stand in the exact spot where Tiger 323 was destroyed. The linden trees are still there. The same trees that appear in the Soviet photographs from May 1945. Linden trees are long-lived. These trees were already mature in 1945. They are ancient now, enormous, their trunks thick and their canopies spreading wide over the avenue. They have been there through the division of Berlin, through the construction and fall of the wall, through reunification, through everything that the city has experienced in the 8 decades since the battle. Stand between those trees today, on the Strasse 17 Juni, and look east toward the Brandenburg Gate. The gate is still there, restored, cleaned, standing exactly where it stood in April 1945. Look slightly to the right, northeast, and you can see the Reichstag building. Also still there, also restored. The great glass dome that now crowns it, designed by the British architect Norman Foster and added after reunification, replaced the original dome that was destroyed in the 1933 fire. But the building itself, its great stone walls, its heavy columns, its broad steps, these are the same walls and columns and steps that Soviet infantry scrambled up under fire on the 30th of April 1945. You can look from where Tiger 323 stood toward the Reichstag and understand immediately and physically, in a way that no map or diagram can fully convey, exactly what the crew of that tank was covering, what they were watching, what they were waiting for. History lives in geography, and in Berlin the geography of 1945 is remarkably well preserved. Battered Panzer. 2 Soviet tanks are preserved very close to where Tiger 323 made its last stand. They stand at the Soviet War Memorial in the Tiergarten, a monument built by the Soviets in 1945, just months after the battle ended, on ground that was technically in the British occupation zone. The British agreed to its construction as a gesture of respect for Soviet losses. The 2 T-34-76 tanks flanking the memorial are said to be among the first Soviet tanks to enter Berlin in April 1945, though this claim, like many things associated with Soviet memorials from this period, should be treated with some caution. What is not in doubt is what lies behind the memorial, a cemetery. Approximately 2,500 Soviet soldiers are buried there, their graves marked with simple stones, their names recorded. 2,500 men who came from across the Soviet Union, from Russia, from Ukraine, from Kazakhstan, from Georgia, from dozens of other places, and who died in the streets and squares and buildings of a city that most of them had never seen before and would never see again. 2,500, in one small cemetery, in one corner of one city. And that number represents just a fraction, a tiny fraction of the 80,000 Soviet soldiers who died taking Berlin in April and May of 1945. The total Soviet dead in the entire Berlin operation, counting all the fighting from the Oder River to the city center, exceeded 300,000 men. 300,000. It is a number that is almost impossible to hold in the mind. Each one of those men was somebody's son. Many were somebody's husband, somebody's father. They had names and faces and lives and futures that were taken from them in the rubble and the smoke of a city that was not their own, fighting a war that they had not started. To total Winkelfront of Germans who defended Berlin lost too. Many of them were soldiers who had been fighting since the beginning of the war, men in their 30s and 40s who had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, only to die in the final weeks. Others were teenagers, boys of 16 and 17 who had been given uniforms and weapons and told to hold streets against a professional army. Others were old men from the Volkssturm, civilians really, with minimal training and obsolete weapons, who fought and died because they were told to, and because they had nowhere else to go. Among those defenders were the 4 men of Tiger 323's crew who did not survive. We know they existed, we know they were there. We know that only one of their number came home. Their names are not recorded in any source I have been able to find. They are among the countless thousands of men on both sides whose individual stories were swallowed by the scale of the catastrophe around them. But they were there, in that tank, in those final hours, doing the job they had been trained to do, in a battle that had already been lost, in a war that was already over, fighting until there was nothing left to fight with. Tiger 323 was not the last Tiger tank to be destroyed in Berlin. That distinction, as I mentioned earlier, belongs to a King Tiger, a Tiger II bearing turret number 314 from the 503rd SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. This vehicle made an extraordinary final stand outside Potsdamer Bahnhof railway station in the southern part of the government district, several hours after Tiger 323 had been destroyed near the Reichstag. The crew of Tiger 300 fought with a ferocity that even their enemies acknowledged. The tank was credited with destroying 39 Soviet armored vehicles, tanks and assault guns before it was finally stopped. And the manner of its stopping was as ironic as anything that happened in those final days. The crew, having run out of ammunition and decided to attempt a breakout, started the engine and tried to move. The King Tiger drove over a German anti-tank mine, one of the mines that the Germans themselves had laid to protect their own positions. The explosion disabled the vehicle. The crew abandoned it and attempted to escape on foot. Most of them did not make it far. 39 Soviet vehicles destroyed by a single tank in a single engagement, in different circumstances, earlier in the war with fuel and ammunition and a functioning supply line, That kind of fighting ability might have mattered. In May 1945, in the ruins of Berlin, it changed nothing. The city fell anyway. The war ended anyway. The only thing it produced was more death on both sides. That is the final truth of the Battle of Berlin, and of Tiger 323, and of every last stand that was made in those final weeks of the war in Europe. The fighting was real. The courage on both sides was real. The suffering was absolutely real. But the outcome was not in doubt. It had not been in doubt for a very long time. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years. And in the spring of 1945, in the ruins of the city where it had been born, it ended. Not with any kind of dignity, not with any kind of meaning, but with the sound of a city burning, and the silence that followed, and 2,500 Soviet soldiers buried in a garden beside a monument that still stands today. And somewhere between those linden trees on the Strasse 17 Juni, where the ground looks completely ordinary now, and tourists walk past without a second glance, Tiger 323 fought its last battle, and 4 men whose names we do not know gave everything they had for a cause that was already lost. If you found this story as compelling as I did, please consider subscribing to the channel. Every subscriber helps make more stories like this one possible. There is no shortage of forgotten history waiting to be told. I will see you in the next video.